Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first Lunch Break Science of 2021. I'm Ariel Johnson with the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting human evolution research and sharing discoveries in programs like this. We'd like to thank Anna Gordon-Getty and Camilla and George Smith, whose generous support made this episode of Lunch Break Science possible. Here with us today is Leakey Foundation grantee Amy Liu. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Amy is joining us from New York, where she is assistant professor of anthropology at Stony Brook University. And she studies primate development, behavior, and endocrinology. And that research takes her all over the world, including the highlands of Ethiopia, where she is co-director of the Simien Mountains Gelada Research Project, and observes gelada monkeys. Here are some geladas. She's also the co-director of the Cludia Pakuna Primate Conservation and Research Project in Sri Lanka and observes langurs there. There's a cute little, well, I guess they're not that little, but today she'll be discussing the effects of takeovers on gelada health and fitness. Before we hear from Amy, if you're watching us live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or Leakey Foundation Live, you can submit questions for Amy anytime in the chat, and Amy will answer those questions, or at least as many as she can, at the end of the episode. The sooner you get those questions in, the more likely she will be able to answer your question. Let's get started and jump in. In episode 14 of Lunch Break Science, we met your colleague and co-director of the Simien Mountains Gelada Research Project, Jacinta Biener, and she kind of told us quite a bit about geladas. But Amy, could you give us a kind of recap on what geladas are and what's so unique about the kind of questions you can ask by observing their behavior?
Yeah, sure. So geladas are cercopithecine primates, so they're closely related to baboons, but they're different in that, well, in a few ways, right? They live at high altitude, and so you can kind of see that they're really, really hairy, right? They don't look like baboons at all. They also are special because they're the only non-human primate that eats grass, right? That's kind of their specialty, although we're now finding out that they rely a lot more on underground storage organs in the dry season as well, which is something that a bunch of people are working on. But to me, what's really cool about them is that they have this multi-level social organization, which really facilitates the collection of a lot of data, because they have these reproductive units that, include 1 to 2 males. One male is kind of the breeder, the alpha male, and then like 2 to 10 females, and you'll see that. I'll have a depiction of how that looks like. But they're embedded in these like large bands of multiple units, right? So what that means is that we can really study a bunch of them at a time, and we can really address questions with a really large sample size. So that's really cool, and we can collect data really easily. Now, coming from the I started off studying arboreal primates. And when you study an arboreal primate, you kind of go out in the morning and you find your monkeys, and then you kind of have to stay with that social group all day. And that social group might also just have, 7, 8, 9 females, right? And a few males. And then you have to continuously follow them, because if you go and follow another group, you'll lose this group, right? So you do that for like 7, 8 days, and then you kind of like start from scratch and you go find another group, and then you spend 7 days with them, right? So this really constrains your ability to collect data. Whereas geladas, you go out, there's 200 individuals. We follow 18 reproductive units at any one time. I think we've actually followed 22 at some point, because they fissioned and they formed new ones and stuff. But like, that means you literally can go out, and they're terrestrial, so you can collect data the whole time you're out there. You're not like sitting there with your binoculars going, can I see a tail? Who is that? Right? And so you can collect data the whole time you're out there. And then when you're done, you can actually just look at another social group, because they're like, 15 meters away. And then hop around, and you can see what's going. You can keep track of births across all 200 individuals or 300 individuals, as long as you know them. So the challenge is, of course, you need to know a lot of individuals, right? And you need to be able to recognize them across units. But the benefits are pretty awesome.
Now, and your work encompasses, or at least your kind of like full body of your research has encompassed several species of monkeys, different methodologies, and just different questions. What first got you interested in studying human evolution?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I actually was really passionate not about non-human primates and behavior, but about human evolution when I was younger. That's kind of what I went to grad school to study. And that passion, I think, was built very early on. So I remember having all these National Geographic books about, like, I mean, typical kid, dinosaurs and mammoths and whatnot. But I also remember it's a very vague recollection, but in elementary school, we used to go to like our elementary school library, which was small, but they used to have film strips. And you might know what a film strip looks like, right? I think maybe the younger viewers may not, but they're basically just videos, the way we used to watch videos. And there was a film strip that talked about Laetoli footprints, and I think I was about maybe third or fourth grade, and I thought it was really cool, and I thought plate tectonics were really cool, and that kind of made me interested in evolution, and that kind of carried forth, I think, in college when I was like, oh, there's actually classes on this stuff in college. But then, when I actually went to actually conduct research and like study bones, I was a little bit bored. And so, since I've always had a really large breadth of interest, I kind of switched in graduate school. So,
Yeah, and you have kind of an unusual trajectory to where you are now at the Simi Mountains Gelada Research Project. Could you tell us a little bit about your path and your early research?
yeah. So, I kind of hopped around a lot. In graduate school, like I said, I started being interested in human evolution, and then I changed somewhere in my second year. And then that's when some reason, I don't know what I read, but I got really hooked on behavioral endocrinology. And this might have been because at the time everybody was coming up with methods to study hormones in wild animals. This is sort of the beginning of that revolution, I guess. And nobody studied it at Stony Brook, so I sent a lot of desperate emails to a lot of labs and got ignored a lot. Then finally, Nancy Sakala at Crest, she was the director of endocrinology in their conservation department there. She said, "Hey, why don't you go ahead and train in my lab?" So I went to San Diego for, I think, 2 summers in a row, and all I got to do was, you know, practice pipetting and decant some elephant urine. I remember there were vats of elephant urine, and she was just like, so just, pipette this elephant urine in these vials. And in hindsight, I realized that it was just to see if I was actually serious and, I was going to stick around. And I grinded up a lot of rhino poop for fecal extractions. But that's kind of how I got into the method, I guess. And then I ended up doing my dissertation in Thailand with Andreas Koenig and Coral Boris. Coral is my advisor. They had a field site in Thailand on leaf monkeys there. So that is actually not quite right as a
Yep.
photograph. That is not Trachypithecus fierii. It's got those white circles. So I think that is obscurus, but it's close. So it looks somewhat like that. But yeah, I started and I did that. So that's when I started doing hormones, and then I actually kind of didn't know. I might be one of the few researchers at my career stage that wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do afterwards. So I never had this sort of set trajectory of, I got an NIH or an NSF postdoc, and I kind of felt around for a while. And then I got bored really quickly not doing research. So I got back in line, so to speak. And then here we are. And I think it's at some point in my postdoctoral years, because I never was dead set on gelatas. I kind of was like, yeah, gelatas are cool. I was the crazy kid that was like, gelatas are cool, but what about all these other animals? And then finally one day it was just like, what? Jacinta was like, why don't you just study gelatas? I was like, okay. And, that's kind of the end of the story. And I guess I didn't say that Jacinta and I met because Nancy no longer directed the lab. That happened while I was in the field. And so I found out, because I had met Jacinta in Gene Altman's lab at Princeton when I visited once, and I heard that she had started a faculty position in Michigan. So I asked her, can I work in your lab and run my samples there? I'll help you set up your lab. And that was sort of the beginning of a very productive relationship.
Yeah, and all just, all coming from a single email,
Yeah. So
You
you
don't
never
know.
know. You never know what people will say if you send them an email, and you should
Especially
always
if you
try.
offer to set up their labs,
Yeah. Like I thought, you got to give something, in return for access, right? So yeah.
So you've been observing geladas for quite a while. What are some of the rarer behaviors that you've seen from geladas in the field?
Yeah, so what I find really cool about studying gelatas is I think it's because of the sheer sample size of animals that we see. We're able to see things that kind of are rare. They might be like individual strategies, things that you wouldn't see if you study 30 animals, let's say. And I'll give you some examples of that. So these are juveniles, what you see on the screen here. So one of the things about juveniles that we found out over studying that many individuals is sometimes, so males, they grow up in their natal groups and they usually disperse into bachelor groups. And I know Jacinta talked about that a little bit, right? That's one of the fundamental features of gelada social life. Um, but one of the things that we've observed over the years is that sometimes we get males that enter into our study units that are males from somewhere else, and they don't appear, I guess we don't know if they're from bachelor units because some males leave really early on and they form these very young bachelor units. But they'll come in at 2 or 3 years old, so that by the time they disperse from this unit that we know, they will actually leave with males that are actually natal males. So it's almost like they form these friendships by joining this unit that is not theirs. Right? And so there are these like interesting little strategies that I don't think we would know about had we not observed that many individuals. We also get, for instance, takeovers where that's when, these males, these bachelor males come in and challenge a leader male and try to quote unquote take over his unit. And what we don't talk about in our papers is sometimes takeovers are very chaotic. And sometimes they're resolved really quickly, right? It's just one and done. You win a fight or you lose a fight and it's over. But sometimes there are multiple males involved and it doesn't get resolved for a really long time. So we had a unit where, geez, I feel like it wasn't resolved for up to a year, and we had almost as many males following the unit as we had females in the unit, right? So we had like 9 or 10 males following around this unit. So whenever we saw them, we were just like, what is that unit? Oh, it's the C's because they're weird. And those males can run the gambit. They can be, former deposed leaders that were followers in other units that just kind of join in when it's chaotic, just I guess to see if they can acquire any reproductive opportunities. It could be really young males who are just like, well, let's see who ends up, I guess, winning. So we get lots of interesting strategies. Like we'll have males that come in and form these friendships with young females just for this chaotic duration. We just see the gambit. And so I think what's cool is that, we see the general gelada strategies, but then we see all these other, I guess I've referenced a lot of alternative male strategies. So we see those. And that's striking to me because it suggests that, our generalizations, they are generalizations, and that there is this individual aspect of behavior, right? That obviously maybe we still can't quantify, but it's cool that we see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So shortly, we'll be turning over the floor to you for your talk, and you'll be discussing gelatas and takeovers. In other primate species, the factors that influence female fitness are things like social status and group size. And you've focused on takeovers for quite some time. What really is the how big a factor are takeovers on gelatas and their lives?
I think the effect of takeovers is pretty tremendous. And what I'm going to talk about today is really there's sort of examples of even this of examples of when we try to depart from takeovers, when we're like, we've got takeovers down, we can control for them. Let's look at these other factors, these sort of quote unquote traditional factors that we think affect female fitness, right?
Yeah.
And let's see what happens. And for some reason, the answers always come back to takeovers. And I just recently had a conversation with Jacinta about this thing, and I was just like, why does it always come back to takeovers? And she goes, it always does, So takeovers have pervasive effects throughout life, and I could talk about some of those in a few minutes or now.
Yeah, let's turn the virtual floor over to you and hear more about the impact of takeovers on gelada health and
Okay,
fitness.
cool. Let me try to share my screen and hopefully this will come off without any major issues.
Yeah, it's it's a very interesting and very timely topic for discussion. And there you go. I'll see you on the other side of your presentation.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to talk about this pervasive effect that takeovers have on gelada health and fitness today. And I want to start by, addressing really what Ariel and I were just referring to, which is that if you study a primate, and especially a cercopithecine primate, one of the first things that comes to mind when you think about fitness, particularly female fitness, is the effect of intrasexual competition, right? So social status, in terms of dominance rank, we generally think of that as having a real big effect on things like how fast you develop, when you mature, how many offspring you have, right? And that's because cercopithecines have this matrilineal dominance hierarchy, right, where females rank close to their relatives, and you rank right underneath your mom. And so over your lifetime, access to resources, which is often shaped by dominance rank, right, is going to structure these potential differences in how well you can do. And of course, another factor that we alluded to was group size. And what we're really talking about here is a number of competitors, right? And the classic idea is that if there are more competitors in your social group, you do worse because there are just simply more mouths to feed, right? So each one of you isn't getting as big of a slice of the pie. Other questions that people have been really interested in are, the effect of social support on fitness and particularly longevity. We haven't done as much of that in our population, but clearly affiliative relationships, right, should influence health and fitness. We know that from humans. We know that from animal models. There's abundant data showing that. But what we've really focused on the Gelada project is the impact of sexual conflict. And just to really quickly define sexual conflict, right? Sexual conflict is just, the conflict that arises because the optimal strategies that improve fitness for males and females might be different. And when those conflicts come to a head, both males and females could actually pay a cost, right? And the big cost that we talk about in geladas is the cost of what happens when a new male comes into a unit, what we call these takeovers, because that male hasn't sired any of the offspring in the unit, but in order to reproduce, he should sire offspring in the unit. And so you get things like sexually selected infanticide, because in order for him to mate with some of these lactating females that have dependent offspring, they need to come back into estrus, right? And that's something that happens a lot in many species of non-human primates, but we study them in geladas because of our fairly large sample size. And so let me talk about that social system in geladas. And this is a slide that I throw up quite frequently in my talks. These little circles here represent reproductive units that I talk about. So you have these symbols for females and symbols for males. And like I said earlier, most often these reproductive units have a leader male. And by leader, I mean the male that sires the majority of the offspring. And then there's often a follower male. That follower male is often the former leader, but sometimes can be another male. And then several adult females, about 2 to 10, and associated offspring. But then outside of those reproductive units, there are these bachelor groups. And these bachelor groups, they're not around the units all year long. There seems to be some seasonal element to when they're close. But the males in these bachelor units really don't have reproductive opportunities. So they have to essentially challenge a leader male in an existing reproductive unit to actually gain any fitness in their lifetimes, right? And so these takeovers, like I said, they're really rare, right? So in geladas, takeovers on average happen once every 2 years in a reproductive unit. But if you're studying 18, 20 units, you can actually see enough takeovers over a certain duration of time. I think we've studied these guys for 15 years to actually say something systematic about them and actually have data that you can analyze quantitatively. So, of course, as I said, this is possible, and we're able to study all these units at once because these units are embedded in these larger, what we call bands, which are just aggregations of these units. So at any point in time, you can see just how many geladas there are, at our field site. So this is a photograph, I think it's taken by Noah Snyder Mackler. Um, and it really shows, so at the far end there on the horizon is the edge of the cliff. So the geladas are getting up. They've gotten up. This is what in the field we affectionately call social hour, because there's like hundreds of animals and they're kind of in their you can kind of see these little, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but you can kind of see reproductive units here. But there's just a ton of them, right? And so you can, if you just want to like take down who's there, whether there's new infants, who's matured, you can really just look at all these individuals within 30 minutes, an hour, if you know their IDs and figure out what's going on. And of course, this keeps going. We can scroll to the right and, it goes on and on and on. And so this really gives us that sample size to address some of these difficult questions. Okay, that wasn't supposed to pop up right away, but never mind that. All right, so I put together this slide to really show you what we know about the effect of male takeovers. And this little like dotted line is kind of like a gelada's life. I don't have an old individual here. We're thinking about how takeovers affect aging now. But what we know thus far is that if you're an infant, of course, those takeovers influence mortality risk because you can be the subject of infanticide. We also know that infants who don't die can suffer injury, and we're currently investigating how it influences other aspects of development like the rate of growth, etc. We know that for juveniles and females, so natal individuals, we know that takeovers elicit a glucocorticoid response. So glucocorticoids are hormones that are part of the HPA axis, and they're commonly associated with stressful events, right? So you get a takeover and you get this immediate rise in glucocorticoids for basically everyone that we've looked at. And so this really tells us that these takeovers are eliciting some sort of metabolic stress response from these guys. And for adult females, we know from various papers, we've looked at pregnancy loss, we've looked at the timing of sex skin swellings that are indicative of fertility. We know that these are also responsive to takeovers. And I think Jacinta talked about that. And what I have down here is this image of, this is May. She was in our units. I don't remember how old she was here, but you can kind of see that she has, it's a little gruesome. She has part of her intestine hanging out here and her mom is grooming her. I like to use May as an example because May is an individual that has suffered back-to-back injuries as a juvenile following a male takeover. And we know that takeovers influence the risk of injury for both young individuals and adults. And for May, these injuries actually added up. I think on record, she's our oldest reproductive maturation. So these injuries influenced her later life history trajectory. And Jacinta last time really talked about how takeovers influence reproductive maturation, right? And just to remind you with this slide, I think the study that she talked about was a recent study that just came out in Current Bio, where we found that takeovers were essentially synchronized with maturation, such that immature females responded to a new leader male, by developing these sex skin swellings on their chest that are associated with the first indications of reproductive maturation. So that was a big finding. It took 15 years for us to actually demonstrate that with an adequate sample size. But it looks like these takeovers are influencing kind of the pace or the timing of female maturation. And we know that these females that mature in response to a takeover actually mature earlier than the average in the population. Now, why are we interested in reproductive maturation? And I just want to give you a brief overview of this. Generally speaking, we think that females who mature early have an advantage because if you mature early, you reproduce early, and all things being equal, you may have a longer reproductive career, although that, of course, also depends on longevity. But if that is the case, you, in theory, should have more offspring over your lifetime, right? So the pace of maturation is important. Now, once we figured out that takeovers mattered and we figured out exactly how they mattered, we were like, that's great. And at least for me and my graduate student, Jacob Fader, we really wanted to say, okay, well, if you control for takeovers, do we still see these classic intrasexual competition predictors play out, right? So gelatas still live in these matrilineal hierarchies. They have social status. They live in groups that vary from 2 to 10 individuals. So do things like maternal rank and group size, do they influence age at maturation like they do in other populations? And the classic prediction is that if you have a mom that's high ranking, so on the right of this purple figure here, then you should mature early because you have access to a lot of resources. So eat a lot, and then you can, you have enough resources to mature early, right? Conversely, if you live in a large group, you would mature late because you have more competitors. So if you live in a small group, you have fewer individuals to compete with and you do better. If you live in a large group, you should do worse. So we took that same data set or a similar data set that we used in the other paper, and we controlled for the immediate effect of takeovers on the timing of maturation. And then we looked at these female social variables. And what we found was somewhat consistent, but somewhat totally opposed to our predictions. So the maternal rank effect played out, but the group size effect didn't. And instead, we found exactly the opposite. We found that females living in large groups actually matured earlier, which led to a lot of head scratching. And there are a couple of potential explanations for this. One is there's literature out there that suggests that there could be intergroup competition, and maybe a larger group can displace smaller groups over resources. So maybe you actually have an advantage to be in a large group, sort of like advantage in numbers. But given that gelatas primarily eat grass that is all over the ground, right, this is probably not a likely explanation. And after a lot of conversation, the only thing that we can come up with is related to takeovers again. So this is just a cartoonish depiction of a bachelor male, and this isn't a bachelor, it's just a really cool picture of a male, so I stuck it in here. But this figure is to really illustrate that from a bachelor male perspective, large units are much more attractive units to take over. And we know this because of this sort of companion paper we've been working on that looks at group size and how that influences female fitness. And we know that large groups are more susceptible to takeovers, and females are more likely to lose infants because there's so many takeovers. So the key point here is that, okay, large groups are associated with takeovers, the likelihood of takeovers. But remember that in our models, we controlled for the direct effect of takeovers, right? Not the likelihood of takeovers, but the direct effect of takeovers. So we should have removed some of that effect. And the only thing we can come up with as a working hypothesis now is that if these young females are taking the presence of a new male as a cue that jumpstarts their reproductive axis, then maybe large units, so it's potentially possible that large units attract bachelors and that bachelors are around and sort of scoping out the scene, which is something that we don't really capture in our data. And if that's the case, maybe some females are kind of making mistakes in their response to males. And the only way we can really address this question is with proximity data between units and bachelors, right? And we have some data on that, but we do not think that we have the density of data to really look at this question right now. Hindsight is 2020. Okay, so kind of on that note, I want to tell you a little bit about where we're currently going and where we're going in the future with this. So part of the funding that I have from the Leakey Foundation right now is to look at takeovers and development. And so one of the things that we suspect is that takeovers might influence the pace of development as measured by growth, for example. And we've used these these sort of parallel lasers to actually measure growth in these young guys. And we've been doing it for years. But of course, it's really, really hard to amass data on development in really, really young individuals and development paired with takeovers in really young individuals. And I can say that we're still working on it. There's some data that suggests that there's some acceleration in development in infants that experience a takeover when they're less than 6 months of age. But that story is still being fine-tuned. And the projects that we kind of want to move forward in the future are how do takeovers affect aging, because for a gelada female, given that there's pregnancy loss, given that it elicits a stress response, given that it influences injury, right? Cumulative exposure to takeovers over a lifetime must have a huge effect on just wear and tear, right? And we expect that to influence potentially the pace of biological aging for females in this population. Okay, and that's kind of all I have. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, so we'll be if you are watching live and have not gotten your questions in, be sure to get those questions in now. This is the time to get them in to the chat. I have an initial question for you, Amy. You know, you've learned quite a bit from observing gelada behaviors. Is there anything that reflects on us humans?
Yeah, I guess a lot. I mean, obviously their social structure is fairly unique, right? And there's not really humans are, at least modern humans we know, they don't live in these same social structures, right? But I think, you know, if you study any social primate, right, you notice things like, I mean, I tend to study a lot of agonism and aggression, but of course the other side of the equation is affiliation. And you couldn't get by in a gelada reproductive unit without affiliation. So as an example, one of the most memorable scenes that I witnessed in the field is we had a unit. So sometimes unit females fission, you know, and classically, if you look at the baboon literature, units usually fission along matrilineal lines, so families sort of like move off. But we had this fission, which was super weird, and they fission exactly along generational lines. So all of the daughter females went away. They were all adults, but all the daughters went into their own unit, and all the moms went into the other unit. And they always kind of like were close together when they ranged during the day. So they kind of were like this extended family that lived next door to each other, and they squabbled. So there was this one female, Coco. And Coco was just, I don't know, for 2 years, she was just mad at the world. And her mom and all her aunties would walk by, and she would just constantly aggress at them and snap at them and snap at them, you know, and the moms would just like, they wouldn't even give her the time of day. They would just ignore her, you know, and that kind of squabble, you know, you see that in gelada life. And I think that, you know, they obviously still groom and they reconcile and they do all these things, right? And so, you know, living in groups is hard work, because obviously you're competing, but you're also, you know, doing all the reconciling and the grooming and the you know, being nice to each other. And I think, you know, we can learn a lot from that, because in wild animals, because, you know, for a gelada female, if she immigrates from her natal group, that has costs. And I think we don't have as many costs. And so, you know, I think that the modern approach to that is, well, I don't get along with you and I'm not going to talk to you. Right. And so I think from wild animals, we can learn a lot from that way they negotiate those conflicts and family. Right.
Well, it's a really interesting perspective. And I think we have our first question from the audience has come in. Basic question: what is endocrine research, and what can it tell us about the study subject? Example: elephants, rhinos, primates, and humans.
Yeah, sure. So endocrine research is the study of hormones. Okay, so and I would say we can broaden that out. There's lots of biomarker research now. You can look at the immune system. That's not the endocrine system, but the methods are somewhat comparable. When you study a wild, so typically if you want to measure a hormone in like a captive primate, like the typical approach is, you know, you do a blood draw, because that's like, we're talking about circulating levels of hormones in your bloodstream. But what's cool is that about, maybe 20 years ago now, people started developing methods to look at hormone metabolites that you excrete in urine and feces. And so this gave us an opportunity to really look at this physiological parameter without actually harming the animals, right? You just fall. I tell my relatives when I try to simplify things, I'm like, I collect primate poop, right? Um, and you can learn all sorts of things, right? You can look at metabolism, you can look at reproduction. So a lot of primates don't have visual signs of like ovulation and stuff like that. So in order to figure out what's going on, you have to collect these biomarkers and quantify them in the lab, right? So there's a lot that you can do with them, and usually you're trying to answer questions where you need to define what's going on with their physiological state, or you want to know if like a takeover is influencing them physiologically, right? So there's a lot of questions you can answer. And now that the development of biomarkers has gone beyond endocrine biomarkers and into immune biomarkers, you can characterize things like how much they're investing in their immune system, whether their immune system is deteriorating with age, all sorts of stuff. Um, you know, it's just cool because it opens up the parameters of what we can find out from a living system, right? Without actually doing anything to them that's harmful.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. And let's see, we have another question coming in. What are the average ages for male and female sexual maturation in geladas?
Yeah. So for females, it's about 4.5 years. And then they give birth about a year and a half after that. So they have like a period of what we call adolescent sterility, where they're quote unquote mature, but they're not actually really that fertile yet. There's variation there, of course, but that's the age. And males, it's a little bit harder to quantify because males go through these stages where they start off kind of looking like females, and then I don't know if you saw those images, males have this like huge cape, right? And they get this large body mass. They have those tufts, right? And then the cape over their backs. Some of those characteristics come in, I would say, around 7, 6-ish, depending on the male. But they don't actually reproduce. So a lot of circumventions, you look at things like testicular descent. That's really hard in geladas because it's cold. So there is no testicular descent, right? And so what we've quantified is males that we have very few males with known ages that we followed from getting born into a unit that we follow into a bachelor group and back into a unit. But the youngest male that's done that, I think, was, God, I want to say about 9. I wrote a paper on it, so I should know, but off the top of my head right now, I believe it was about 9. But we don't have that many males that we can follow that trajectory because the bachelors can go somewhere else, in our study site that we don't follow, right? So we don't have that many males that we know from kind of beginning to end. So a lot of the males that come into our units and become leaders, we never known before because they come from elsewhere, because it's male dispersal.
That's it's just their behavior is so strange sometimes.
I mean, I would love it if someone really was able to follow the life of a male gelato, like
Yeah.
But I think we would have to collar them, and I don't know. We can't collar adult males really because it could affect their entire fitness trajectory, right?
Yeah.
And but it is really curious because males, they become leaders. Sometimes they are leaders for like 6 months, 2 years, they get deposed. And sometimes there are males that have stuck around for like 7 years and had tons of offspring. They have units with 10 females, and their units are massive. There's so many offspring, and then they get deposed. And some of those males still stick around as followers somewhere else. So there are definitely males that are way more successful than others. And then some males end up back in bachelor units when they're old. So we've seen former leaders go back to bachelor units, right? So there's a lot of variation, and I would love to know more about males, because one of the things that we noticed, which I know Cheryl Knott told me she also noticed with orangutans, is that males, like, even if they're kind of old, they'll when they're the leader, they look great. They look in great condition. And then as soon as they're deposed the next day, they look like old men. It's
Interesting.
like there's this rapid like process where testosterone's plummeted, I guess, and now all of a sudden they look bad. And I would love to know what actually does that. And I think we might be getting at some of those questions soon. I think there's a graduate student working on it. So
Oh, I'll have to keep in touch on that one.
yeah.
We have another question from the audience. It's on its way.
Okay.
Do gelatas go into caves?
Not that I know of. I mean, I don't actually know. I don't think there are cliffs. I mean, caves on the cliffs. We don't know what happens on the cliffs. I'll tell you that. So they sleep on the cliffs at night, and we don't know what they do there other than cling and sleep. I don't know how you sleep on a cliff. I would fall over, obviously, but they're better at it. But not that I know of.
Okay. Well, I'll have to kind of maybe we'll have to have a gelada informant go tell us about their secret lives on the cliffs. Okay, our next question is: do primates share with us the same hierarchy of needs, Maslow?
I'm not familiar with that. I don't. The hierarchy of needs. Is there any way the question can be clarified?
Let's see if maybe we can have our viewer clarify their question, and
Okay.
we'll take another question in the meantime.
Okay.
Could you give us an update on how the COVID-19 pandemic is currently affecting the research activities at your
Yeah.
field site?
A lot. We left, shortly after, basically at the same time that everybody left in March. We had sent a few grad students back. I want to say 2 or 3 months ago, and we sent them out with COVID test kits and had all these quarantine procedures. And they eventually left after a few weeks, but that was because there was political instability in Ethiopia on top of COVID. We do have Ethiopian staff that are still going out and checking on the gelato, so we're collecting like basic data right now. But we don't have any students or camp managers there right now. Yeah. And we don't follow them closely anymore. We stay pretty far back.
Well, before we close, we have not. Oh, let me make sure we didn't get an update. Okay. Before we close, do you have any advice for those people watching today who are interested in pursuing animal behavior or studying animals?
Yeah, I mean, go out and do it. Depends on what animals you're interested in, but there are lots of field sites that look for students that want to do field research for a year. I think a lot of those now come with stipends, so hopefully you don't have to pay for yourself. I think hopefully the era of that is largely over, as long as funding agencies cooperate with us. Essentially, go pursue your passions. And, I would also say don't be limited to study systems. I mean, I always encourage students to do several rotations in different labs to figure out what's for them, because maybe, endocrine research isn't for you and you want to be in a genomics lab, but you'll never know that unless you hop around. So I would say go and try to get opportunities and ask, ask if you can be supported, find ways to get funding. Or if those don't work, there are opportunities in North America that maybe are not primates, but they're close to home, they're cheaper to get into, and they can be just as fulfilling. I know that I often will watch squirrels now. I mean, after studying arboreal primates, I think I came back the first year, and every single time I heard something in a tree, I was like, oh, what's that? And it's a squirrel. But, squirrels can be fascinating, if you really get into it. And, there are obviously also, social carnivores. There's wolves in the US. There's all sorts of stuff. And I would say, go where your curiosity leads you, because that's the thing that's going to get you get you to stay in science and make you wake up every day, wanting to stay, is that curiosity. So pursue it.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful advice, Amy. And thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. It's fun.
Yeah, yeah. You can visit us at leakeyfoundation.org to learn more about the Leakey Foundation, Amy Lou, as well as how you can help support research like Amy's and educational programs like Lunch Break Science. Right now, all donations will be doubled by 2 generous donors, meaning your impact will be doubled. On February 4th, we meet Leakey Foundation scientist Johannes Haile Selassie, one of the world's foremost experts in paleoanthropology, and learn about his work uncovering fossils in Ethiopia. Be sure to subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about upcoming episodes and events, as well as groundbreaking discoveries in human evolution research. If you're still hungry for science and can't wait until February, check out the Leakey Foundation's award-winning podcast, Origin Stories, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Lunch Break Science is made possible by the generous support of the Anne and Gordon Getty Foundation and Camilla and George Smith. Thank you all for taking a break from your day and feeding your brain with the Leakey Foundation. Until next time, stay hungry for knowledge.